Hi there. Welcome back to another exciting edition of Pandemic Radio. I'll be your host today. I'm Dr. Barrett Bales, and today we're going to be talking about the origins of emerging infectious diseases. This is going to set us up for understanding the origins of the COVID 19 pandemic. But to do so, we first need to get a better perspective of these new infectious diseases like COVID, but there are many others, and get a kind of baseline understanding about where they come from and a little bit of the ecology of these diseases. So, in general, infectious disease mortality has been on the decline. If you look over the last 100 or so years, um, infectious disease mortality has dropped relative to mortality from other causes like non-infectious diseases, cancers, heart disease, etc. So if you look at this timeline, you see the line in, I guess it's kind of like a gold yellow. It's trending down with the notable exception of 1918. You see a gigantic spike in mortality. That is the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic, which you guys have probably heard of recently. Um, it was an anomaly. It was a catastrophic global event that really had this immediate impact on mortality rates around the world. But aside from that, in general, infectious disease death has been on the decline. But in recent years, uh, a suite of new diseases have emerged. We talked a little bit about HIV/AIDS in the last lecture on planetary health, but there are many others, and we're currently living through the result of one right now. COVID 19 is considered an emerging infectious disease. And emerging infectious diseases kind of fall into two broad categories. The first is uh, kind of new on the scene diseases like COVID, where they are previously unknown or undiscovered, and they are rapidly increasing both in incidence and across new geographic areas. So COVID is all of those. It is previously unknown. It is newly discovered. It is rapidly increasing and across a wide geographic range because it's everywhere. Other examples include HIV, SARS, which is a relative of COVID 19. We'll talk a little bit more about that in upcoming lectures. Lyme disease, Zika virus, West Nile virus, to name a few. Reemerging infectious diseases are those that are reappearing or emerging after being on the decline for quite a long time. So it's not necessarily new diseases, but it's diseases that were going down and then are recently basically coming back. A big part of this reemergence is human behavior. So, the overuse of antibiotics is driving antibiotic resistant pathogens. The anti vaccination movement and anti vaccination beliefs drives the reemergence of vaccine preventable diseases. These are a few examples of how human behavior can influence the emergence of infectious diseases. So, some examples include measles, pertussis, gonorrhea. Those are not new diseases, but they are newly reemerging. Of these emerging infectious diseases, a good proportion, roughly 75%, give or take, come from animals. So most emerging infectious diseases have an animal source or an animal, what's called reservoir, the place where the pathogen, the virus or bacteria or whatnot, comes from. In fact, the three most devastating pandemics in human history, the so called Black Death, which was a bubonic plague outbreak, Spanish influenza, and HIV/AIDS all are examples of zoonotic diseases. They all have animal origins, and we can lump COVID in with that group, and we'll talk about the origins of that disease in another lecture. So, like I said, we are trending in the wrong direction if you are not a fan of having to worry about infectious diseases like COVID. We were on the decline, and now we are seeing an increase. And this is for many different reasons. And I would say a short answer is it's complicated. A slightly longer answer is that it's typically the result of a mixture of social and environmental factors or causes. And it's really kind of depends on the disease, what the specific kind of combination of factors are. But in general, when you look across a lot of the emerging infectious diseases, you see some kind of common sets of causes. So the growing human population is a big cause. International transportation of people, and shipping, uh, things for sale, food, goods, stuff like that. Just the transportation of stuff. Redistribution of human settlements. So as people are building new houses and new locations, maybe clearing some forest to build a housing development, uh, basically expanding the footprint of where we live. Uh, Large kind of global changes to our environment, including changes to the Earth's climate, is another significant cause. The agriculture and food processing industries, the increased rate at which humans and animals, wild animals, are coming into contact with one another. War and social disruption, that's a big one. For example, in the Spanish influenza 1918 influenza pandemic, that occurred right on the heels of a world war. So the world was reeling from this war, and that kind of disruption really uh, allowed this influenza pandemic to really kind of take hold. And things like the construction of dams. So we mentioned in the last lecture that a majority, more than half of all rivers on the planet, have been dammed, and that has serious implications for infectious disease emergence. So a lot of this has to do with how we are making changes to the natural environment. And we can put a lot of these trends together, and we can look for these kind of common patterns, and we can use that to predict or to try to kind of guess or map where these emerging infectious disease events are most likely to occur. And this is one of kind of several maps that have been published. I kind of like the color on this one, so I'm going to go with it. But they all tend to show similar locations where you would expect these diseases to basically originate from. So you see Southeast Asia, parts of sub Saharan Africa, and then some parts of the Americas. And it's for this reason a lot of scientists who study this were not surprised by the origins of COVID 19 uh, being in the part of the world that it came from. And it's because we have been anticipating emerging infectious diseases to come from these areas. And a lot of the reason for that is because in these areas, a lot of those factors, those social and environmental factors that drive disease, are happening at increased rates in these areas. It's also because infectious diseases tend to be uh, more suitable for tropical climate conditions. So you see a lot of the emergence areas occur, within a range of the equator and the tropics. Not always, but that's where you tend to see a concentration. And when you look at a map on the left of where humans are basically having the greatest impact on the environment, so that's things like building new houses and deforestation and agriculture and all those things we talked about, uh, the areas in darker red and into like the kind of purple colors are where humans are having the greatest impact. And when you compare it to the map of where we expect infectious diseases to emerge and pop out from, you see a relationship there. So that's not a coincidence that we can uh, make that kind of assumption that how humans impact and change the environment is a significant contributor to emerging infectious disease risk. So again, this helps us to understand and uh, really use the fundamental question in the planetary health uh, framework, which is, we want to understand why a disease like COVID-19 is happening. We want to understand why a disease like HIV happened or why Zika virus happened. Um, And to do so, we need to ask this basic question that are these diseases the result of how we change the environment? And how we change the environment, again, can have a lot of different consequences for human health. It doesn't just have to be things like Ebola and COVID and other kind of infectious diseases. It can affect chronic diseases, mental health can be affected, nutrition can be affected. There's a lot of different impacts, and it really depends on the kind of environmental change that we're talking about, whether we're talking about climate change, deforestation, damaging coral reefs, draining wetlands, the extinction of animal species. All of these things have different possible effects on human health, and we can kind of broadly categorize those impacts in one of three ways. The first is like direct, immediate impacts. So, climate change is contributing to more intense heat waves, and heat waves can have a very direct, immediate effect on health. That would be considered like a direct health effect. The other type is what's called ecosystem mediated. So that's like adding a few more kind of elements to the chain of cause and effect. And an example of that would be um, like deforestation. So, deforestation would be an example of an environmental change. And one of the things that a forest ecosystem does is it keeps infectious diseases, it keeps viruses and bacteria in a kind of like state of equilibrium. So it keeps them from really like taking off. And when humans um, kind of mess with the forest or they damage the forest or they fragment it, you've really like undermined the forest's ability to really kind of balance the number of viruses and things like that. And we'll get into what that actually looks like in a second. But when like we have damaged an ecosystem's ability to help us control diseases, then it's considered like an ecosystem mediated disease. And we're going to make the argument in this class that COVID-19 is an example of an ecosystem mediated emerging infectious disease outbreak. Why this is important is because, again, we want to understand why COVID-19 happened, and so we need to understand the kind of chain of events that led up to COVID-19 emergence. And if we can identify how we maybe interacted with the environment, how we maybe changed the environment that allowed COVID-19 to happen, then we can have a better understanding for maybe, hopefully, preventing future pandemics. And then indirect health effects um, are a little more kind of hard to quantify. So if rising sea levels force you from your home and you have to move to like a new area, and long term that causes a lot of stress, anxiety, and maybe depression, um, that is kind of like more of an indirect health effect of that climate or environmental change. And when we deal with those like middle diseases, that's a field of study called disease ecology. When we want to understand the relationship between ecosystems and disease, uh, people that study that typically call themselves disease ecologists. A lot of my research deals with disease ecology, and it's really this like kind of intersection between environmental science, biology, um, the understanding of ecosystems, and things like public health and epidemiology. So it's kind of like right in between. And planetary health really uses disease ecology in a pretty big way. And what, again, I really find interesting and cool about planetary health is, yes, I know I'm a big nerd, but the kind of like surprises. So, COVID-19, uh, it wasn't necessarily unexpected. We, like I said, had been kind of anticipating that something like this might happen. But again, it is a surprise in that we don't know exactly where it's going to happen, and we don't know what the virus is actually going to be. And we're really just discovering a lot of the health impacts of changes to the environment. So how we interact with the earth um, can have more obvious health impacts, like worse forest fires or sea level rise, but some of the health impacts can be pretty weird and pretty surprising. So what planetary health is really useful for is helping us like anticipate and understand these kind of surprising consequences. So here's an example. Let's say we are looking at a farmer in Belize, and he is changing the landscape in that area to grow more crops. So this is an example of agriculture, and he is using fertilizer to grow better food. And let's say it's maybe it's raining more because one of the impacts of climate change is more intense rainstorms. So maybe an intense rainstorm kind of comes in and washes a lot of that fertilizer into the nearby river. And let's say that fertilizer containing things like nitrogen and phosphorus flows downstream, maybe like 100 miles away, really long ways away. Um, and because fertilizer makes plants happy, it causes this boom in local wetland vegetation, like these kind of reedy plants. And, so far it's like, well, okay, so he caused that activity caused some wetlands to grow more lush, downstream. So what's the big deal? Well, this becomes a public health problem when the mosquitoes find out about this, and it turns out mosquitoes love to live in this kind of reedy vegetation. And the type of mosquito that likes to live in this reedy vegetation is very well suited for transmitting malaria. And so, because of this use of fertilizer 100 miles away, we could potentially get a malaria outbreak, maybe 2 or 3 months later. So, when you're looking to explain, well, why did this malaria outbreak happen? Maybe you're a public health worker and your job is to go investigate this sudden malaria spike. Uh, your job is to understand why it's happening. Are you necessarily immediately going to think, well, I think it's because maybe how people are farming 100 miles away? Probably not your first instinct, but that is the real kind of culprit here. And planetary health is a framework that allows us and really expects us to start thinking in this way. So here's a fun example that some of you have seen, some of you have not. But it's worth repeating because I think it's a fun example. Well, I won't say fun, I'll say interesting. Uh, Example of a surprising kind of health consequence. So, public health workers were investigating this outbreak of anthrax in Siberia, which is a part of Russia, really, really cold up near the Arctic Circle. And anthrax is a bacteria that kind of forms these spores. There's a picture of it right there. It's rare. It's deadly. It is found in the soil, like in the dirt. So usually, it only makes grazing animals sick. Animals that are down, like eating grass and kind of sniffing around in the dirt. Um, Humans can sometimes become infected when they come into contact with an animal that's been infected. Um, and you know, disease outbreak investigators were investigating this and saying, well, why is there like anthrax like in Siberia? Think about Siberia. Think about like all the vacations you don't want to take there because it's so cold and desolate, and there's nothing there that would really immediately suggest that anthrax should be there. So when you start to kind of connect the dots, and when you use a planetary health approach to kind of understand that there's some reason why anthrax is happening like this, why there's an outbreak, because diseases don't just happen randomly. Um, you know that places that are really cold, like Siberia, have basically permanent layers of ice. So when it snows, it basically is so cold that the snow and ice don't really melt; they just kind of build up on top of each other. And so year after year, the snow and ice just kind of build up, and they form these really thick layers called permafrost. And uh, we know from historical records that about 75 years ago, there was a large die off of reindeer from anthrax. So a bunch of reindeer died in this area about 75 years ago. And the locals basically just kind of dug shallow graves and buried them, and then it snowed, and then the next year it snowed, and it's over time they kind of got pushed down into the permafrost. And so, you know, they no longer really pose a threat because now they're buried deep, deep within the permafrost. But this part of the world is warming at a faster rate than other parts of the world. So the climate change uh, problem is causing temperatures to rise in Siberia, among other places. And this is causing permafrost layers to melt, and it is therefore exposing these viruses and bacteria that have been buried sometimes for centuries. For example, in the reindeer that died 75 years ago, those anthrax spores are now finding their way back to the surface, and anyone who's in that area are exposed. So if you think about what else could be down there, what else could be there besides just like anthrax reindeer? Um, are we kind of opening this Pandora's box? And if you remember your mythology, that was, I think a pretty good kind of comparison of what might be happening here. What other diseases and viruses and bacteria might be buried in the permafrost that are now coming up to the surface because of a warming climate? So we know smallpox is no longer a disease we worry about because it has been eradicated, but it used to kill quite a few people, and those people and the virus that killed them are down there in the permafrost. As well as weird viruses that we don't even know what they do. Giant viruses, they're called gyruses, and I didn't make that up. That's what they're called, gyruses, um, are also being discovered. So again, a lot of these emerging diseases have animal origins. HIV is thought to come from primates. Influenza comes from waterfowl, pigs, and chickens. Ebola comes from um, primates. Let's see, SARS, civet cats. If you don't know what a civet cat is, Google it. They're pretty. So a lot of these diseases have animal origins, and bats get a lot of attention because they are responsible for a lot of zoonotic emerging infectious diseases. Diseases like Ebola, SARS, um, and some of the lesser known diseases like Marburg and Nipah have been traced to the world's only mammal capable of long flight. So, oh, isn't it cute? One thing to note here, we're going to kind of go into why bats are a public health issue, but they are a crucial ecosystem service for human health. They are really important pollinators. They control insect populations. Without bats, we would be in serious trouble. So bats are something worth um, preserving and protecting. And really, what we're seeing is it's how humans are interacting with bats that is really causing the problem. So, why bats? Like, of all those animals that I mentioned, why bats? So again, they are the only mammal capable of sustained flight. And they have really, really like high octane, high functioning immune systems. Their body temperatures, for example, will spike when they are gearing up to go fly around, and their bodies actually get pretty hot. Um, they have this really amazing immune system, and scientists are actually like studying them to see if there are any kind of disease fighting properties that they could try to understand for human health. But when a virus is in a bat, so not all bats have viruses in them, just like not all people have viruses in them, but when a virus does find its way into a bat, it can replicate within a bat without damaging it. So because the bats have such good immune systems, they don't tend to get sick or get hurt from the viruses that are reproducing in them. Well, side note, viruses don't reproduce; they take over your cells and make them do the reproducing. But I digress. So when a virus leaves a bat and comes into contact with another animal, like a person, that does not have as high or good of an immune system, now all of a sudden, it's basically relatively much more dangerous and more virulent. So it's not dealing with an immune system that is so strong compared to the bats. Bats are capable of long flight, and they fly across large geographic areas. Um, and because of that, they can really spread a large number of viruses and other pathogens. Like I said, when they fly, their body temperatures peak, and this is something that humans do, but when we are sick, we get a fever and we get a temperature. And the viruses actually living in the bats have developed this like defense mechanism against this temperature spike, which has allowed them to live inside the bats so long and so well. So they've developed this ability to withstand temperature spikes. And if they've developed an ability to withstand temperature spikes, this leaves humans kind of at a loss because that's like our best defense mechanism against virus infections. That's why we have fevers, is to try to kind of kill the virus. When bats get stressed out, for example, when their homes are destroyed because of like logging or deforestation activities, um, they actually will excrete more infectious particles. So they will actually, more virus will leave a stressed out bat than a non stressed out bat. And this is, we can see an example of this, like if people get cold sores when they're stressed out, you might get a kind of like a cold sore virus little outbreak. So it's a similar kind of situation. So what's a great way to like really stress out a bat? Well, if you've ever seen a wet market or know anything about it, it's basically like a kind of farmer's market, but they sell live animals, and it's a popular kind of market in Southeast Asia, and it's a way of uh, from a kind of epidemiology standpoint, really increasing risk of contact between animals and people. So again, we don't have disease if there are no people around. And a great way to complete the epidemiology triangle is to introduce humans and animals together. This is a good way to do that. And if I'm a bat and I'm in a cage in an environment like this, I'm probably pretty stressed out. And when I'm stressed out, I secrete more viruses. So we can see that this kind of thinking is why we consider changes to ecosystems such a big public health threat. We're learning more and more about the public health consequences of things like this picture. Deforestation has been linked to many different public health problems because a healthy forest ecosystem is good for human health. One of the ways or reasons for that is because it keeps viruses away from us. And when we go in and kind of destroy the forest or alter it like this, the forest is no longer kind of able to protect us from those viruses. So one of the things like a dense forest does is it kind of keeps us away from animals. It keeps the animals in the forest, and then we don't come into contact with them as much. So when we're not coming into contact with the animals, there's less risk of disease. HIV and Ebola are classic examples of diseases that probably spread to humans who came into contact with infected wildlife, most likely because of events like this deforestation. And it's because the forest ecosystem can no longer help protect us or guard us against these diseases. So, Ebola in West Africa is the case study that I want to talk about because there are a lot of parallels with how we understand COVID-19 emerged. So, there's a scary bat. I think it's kind of cute. And bats play a critical role in the kind of, I guess you would say, life cycle or reproductive cycle of the Ebola virus. So Ebola basically circulates among bat populations in the forest. And that's not a public health issue if there are no people around. So if it's just bats out doing their bat thing, uh, going about their bat business, and the virus kind of bounces around between them, that's not a big issue. Um, it becomes a big issue for people when the virus gets into other animals. So let's say the bat is eating some fruit on a tree and it has some droppings that contain the Ebola virus. And it happens that there are maybe some primates, like some chimpanzees, also eating the fruit from that tree, and they become infected with the Ebola virus because of that contact. When that infected animal, like that chimpanzee, passes the virus to a human population, the virus now has spilled over, and this is the term for when a emerging zoonotic disease makes its way from the animals in the forest to people. It's called a spillover. So, what we're interested in understanding as public health people is how did it spill over? So, we can kind of understand it's kind of a natural thing for the Ebola virus to go around in bats, and then for sometimes to make its way to other animals like chimpanzees. But what we're really concerned with is understanding that last step. How did the virus then make its way to people? And if you look at all the Ebola outbreaks in recent history on the map on the left, and you look at on the map on the right, areas in purple are where there has been deforestation. So the more purple, the more forest that has been lost. And if you look at the two maps side by side, you see that the biggest Ebola outbreak in history that occurred in 2014 is also where there is the most deforestation occurring in West Africa. And part of what deforestation does is it allows bushmeat hunting to happen basically at higher rates. So, bushmeat hunting is essentially the practice of um, hunting or harvesting basically animals from the forest, any animal, to use as a food source. And it's called bushmeat, and included on the menu sometimes are primates. So this is a baboon that has been hunted. This is a bushmeat hunter, and he is taking the bushmeat back to his village to um, as a food source. Um, you can see a lot of blood. You can see the risk of infection is a lot higher uh, in this kind of circumstance than a lot of others, because there's a lot of exchange of bodily fluids, and if that primate maybe happened to come into contact a few days earlier with one of those bats that carried Ebola, now this primate has Ebola in it. Um, we can see that this is a pretty high risk, uh, basically circumstance for a spillover event. So that's one of the ways that the virus can make the jump from bat to person. It typically takes a few steps. One of the steps includes the primate animal, and it really is the chain of events is really started by how we are interacting with the forest ecosystem. So it's really not the bat's fault. Uh, it's really like how we are changing the forest ecosystem that allows all these events to come together. So when the virus again is just naturally circulating out in the forest, the forest is protecting us from this by basically just existing. So the forest makes it harder for us to get into contact with this chain of infection. We're not able to travel as deep into the forest. There's just not as many people around. So that's like the way that the forest is protecting us. It's keeping us away by just being a forest. Thanks, forest. And in this equation, we know that we don't have disease because we're missing a human host. There are no people here, so there is no disease. But we can increase the number of people here if we deforest, or we fragment the forest in a way that allows people to travel deeper into the forest. So here's a scenario. This is my graphic design skills really in full effect. The green is the forest, the yellow are two villages, and the little lines are the trails that the bushmeat hunters take. The stars are where the bushmeat hunter could come into contact with Ebola. It's possible, but it's uh, it's relatively rare. Now, let's say the line in red is a logging road that is built to extract lumber from the forest. Now, all of a sudden, that bushmeat hunter is able to travel deeper into the forest by taking those logging roads. All of a sudden, there are many more opportunities for contact with the virus. And this is thought to contribute to a lot of the Ebola outbreaks that have happened. This is also thought to be how HIV initially spilled over into human populations. This is the same kind of mechanism that exists for a lot of emerging infectious diseases. And we're going to use this as really our case study and remember this when we start discussing the origins of COVID 19. And you can see that this really is a good example of this kind of complex mixture of social and environmental kind of factors or drivers. So, with planetary health, we're asking the question that I think is really important is, understanding where it came from, but really what we care about in public health is, can we prevent this from happening? Can we prevent that jump or that spillover in the first place? And with planetary health, we are able to basically redefine public health and prevention by including more upstream solutions that include safeguarding the environment. So, by uh, conserving the rainforest, by limiting the amount of deforestation, that's actually a public health intervention. And planetary health uh, is how we frame that. So, that's it for this little chat and introduction to the ecology and origins of infectious diseases, emerging infectious diseases. And we will continue our journey into the origins of COVID-19 next time. So this is Dr. Bales signing off.